Did, and I sent it to Michael and Claudia.
Normally I would wait to press record, but I can't not record this. Jeff, what were you just telling me about a shop that sells affordances?
I was in Oxford, and there was a shop on the corner that, or maybe not on the corner, but on the street that sold affordances called Objects of Use.
I I need a picture of this.
I have one. I will send it to you. I sent one to Michael and Claudia. It turns out it's not quite as exciting as it seems, but it's like a kitchen gadget store. But I was like, Objects of Use.
I mean, okay, but we're going to include this photograph in our new book. I'm just putting that out there.
Okay.
Well, I nearly always say that I'm extremely excited, but on this occasion, I am extremely excited. I'm always extremely excited, but in particular in this case, because I'm joined by Julia Blau and Jeff Wagman, who've written this amazing book, which you can't quite see, but here it is there. An Introduction to Ecological Psychology, a lawful approach to perceiving, acting, and cognizing. I am going to touch on that a little bit, but I feel like, I mean, I know this book's been out a couple of years now, about a couple of years, is that right?
Yeah, about right.
Something like that. And I don't know why I haven't found it before. I stumbled across it because of an interview you had with a YouTuber called Bren Does Movement, who I'm due to get on the show actually, because I feel like we are kindred spirits. And it was a
Absolutely.
fabulous conversation. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fact that you moved from location to location in the conversation, but it was really nice. And you guys made some quotes that I'm absolutely shamelessly going to steal. One in particular, you said, I think, Jeff, which was about physics is good for chess, but not so good for frisbee, something along those lines. I can't remember.
Oh
I've stolen
boy.
that one too. That's a good
No,
one.
I think I said, and in fairness, I think I stole this from Andy Clark, who's a philosopher, and it was uh, computers are good at chess
That's
and
it.
bad at frisbee.
That's it.
Sure.
Computers. That's
Yeah,
correct.
something
That's it.
like
That's
that.
it.
But
Yeah. So
it's a way to think about what I think it's a way to take all of the skill that we've built into computing devices, including AI nowadays,
Oh God.
and completely flip it upside down because as good as AI is at doing what it doesn't do the things that very simple creatures like
We have a
insects
problem.
do easily. And
Yeah.
so we're solving, um, you know, you could say we're solving the hard problems before we're solving the easy problems, or you could say that we've actually going after the easy problems and trying to figure out chess and, how to generate a sentence from a stem. And
Sure.
the harder problem is how to play frisbee or, how to intercept how to drive your car um, or whatever.
remind me, I must come back to AI because I discovered something about AI that I think you'll both find really interesting, or at least I hope you will. Before we jump into that, I wonder if I could ask you both, maybe Julia first, if you wouldn't mind just giving a little bit of your potted history in this field and how you ended up exploring and writing about Fred, who, by the way, I've become to love and is now a little friend of mine personally. But
Oh,
anyway,
me too. Oh, thank you. I love Fred. Yeah, no, so my name's Julia Blau. I got into this field. I was a undergraduate at the University of Connecticut, and I was a psych major, and I took sensation and perception with Claudia Carello. And I mean, maybe a month into that class, and I went up to her after class and I just went, how do I become you when I grow up? Um, because I had fallen in love with the class and I had fallen in love with her. And I was just like, this stuff is incredible. And it's, making my brain explode. Like it all feels new. And it's like it finally puts together some things that I learned in all these other places. They all kind of came together in that class. And I got very excited about it. And and goes into her bag and she pulls out an application to do an independent study. And she's got a sticky note on it that says my name. And she says, I've been waiting for you to ask, and hands it to me.
wow.
This
What a
is,
moment.
so I started doing research with her. And then towards the end of that, she says, okay, now you got to come be my grad student. So I applied for the program there. She actually wrote me my recommendation letter to get into her program. So I always sort of wondered how that went, right? Like, dear me, Julia's fantastic. Love me like that. But anyway, it was great, and I really loved it. But I will say that I spent the first couple of years in that program drowning. I mean, just drowning because there was so much, and so much of it was written at a level that was very difficult to enter into. And so Jeff and I have one of the goals of this book that we're here talking about was to try and make it so that people didn't have to have that experience, the one I did, where you're sort of run into a wall. Your interest is there, your desire is there, the intelligence is there, but man, it's just a wall, a barrier to entry. So we were trying to write something that would help us help someone like me get into the field just a little bit easier. So this is how I ended up here. This is where I'm at.
Amazing, thank you. And Jeff?
Well, I'm Jeff Wagman. I had a similar entry to the field. I went to college at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania called Franklin and Marshall College. And we were extremely fortunate to have one of the pioneers of ecological psychology there when I was there. His name was Ed Reed, and he died tragically young. But he was there long enough to make an impression on me. And while I was there, I also did some research with a professor who studied perception. He wasn't an ecological psychologist per se, but he was interested in applied questions like um, driving at night and things like that. So he was kind of, you might call him a human factors or a perceptual, just a straight perception psychologist. But he appreciated the ecological view and what it could bring to trying to understand problems like that. And so when it came time to apply to graduate school, I applied to a few different programs, some of whom were, some of those were led by the students of Michael Turvey and Claudia Carello. Um, but I also applied to that program at University of Connecticut, the same program that Julia went to. And when I went to visit, I was completely floored by really it was by the students who I met. The older students in that program were so impressive to me, and I could do some name dropping if you want. People like Mike Riley and Brett Fajan
Yeah.
and Ramesh Balasubramaniam, Kevin Shockley.
Mm.
These people were all so impressive to me, and I wanted to be like them. So so Julia wanted to be like Claudia. Well, I wanted to be like these students,
Yep.
and then on top of that, realizing that there were um, Michael Turvey and Claudia Carello were in charge of the whole lot, and I thought,
Mm.
well, this is where I want to be. I just felt really at home there. It felt at home both just in a personal level, but also an intellectual level, and
Mm.
off I went.
I mean, I love those stories. It's not dissimilar to one of my stories, but in a very different route. I found and discovered sports ethics through a guy called Professor Mike McNamee when I was at University in Cardiff, and he encouraged me to follow him to do a scholarship at a new institution that he was going to. So I started my postgrad in sports philosophy, sports ethics. I didn't fully complete it into a PhD as I was originally supposed to, largely just because of life stuff. But it's the itch that's I've never been able to scratch. So I've always wanted to come back to it. But I've now obviously discovered a love of ecological dynamics, and I might come back to you actually a little bit later on because I believe that I've got some interest, hopefully fairly interesting thoughts around the role of ecological psychology in sport and the ethical dimensions it brings to sports coaching. We come on to that a little bit later on. Um, this is going to be a magical mystery tour. There is no It's not going to be linear. Of course, it's not going to be linear. I'm going
Nothing
to
ever
take a very
is.
non-linear approach to this conversation because I very often read books sideways and backwards and all these sorts of things. There's so many areas that pique my interest. Um, I genuinely felt as well. When I listened to you guys talk, I then immediately got the audiobook and started listening to it on my various journeys, and then I've got the actual book itself. What I found, what I thought was actually what you said, Julia, which was this idea that actually this is the kind of introduction that you need in order to really get into it. Now, Rob Gray, as we mentioned, so you guys have met Rob, and I said that his podcast and mine, we started at similar times, and Rob's been on my podcast several times. I've been on his a couple of times. Rob has actually done a. He's come on my pod. I have a learning group, kind of community of learning, and Rob's actually come on that group on a couple of occasions to road test some theories with that group. He says that he took it's a Gibsonian idea, what was called Gibson apparently had a purple peril, which was when he
Hmm.
would take his ideas in front of the students. And so Rob's been brave enough to do that and put it out there on the podcast. So I've got a lot of admiration for the stuff that Rob's been doing. And obviously, Rob, I said Rob's podcast is like the brainy older brother. He, the, Rob and I have like sort of been, kind of like going back and forward and all those sorts of things. And I felt like his books have been brilliant as well. He's made them particularly the first one, How We Learn to Move, which was like from a sporting practitioner's perspective, really
Right.
grabbed, in terms of and sort of got some of the concepts and applied them in the sporting dimension. And then he's obviously written a couple of other ones. But this one for me, what it did that was different from what Rob did was like really got to grips with the the underlying theories around ecological psychology, because the sports world have sort of melded together ecological psychology and dynamical systems theory and created sort of ecological dynamics as a way of us trying to make sense of like kind of the sports world. More to talk about there. But what I liked was, firstly, you got your character, Fred, who's navigating his way through the world with all these different problems. What I really
Yep.
liked was the way you brought to life some of the experiments that have been done over the years in this field, and those experiments, the stories behind those experiments and all those sorts of things, for me, really gave some of that kind of empirical, well, in fact, evidence shows the evidence base behind ecological psychology. And that's one of the criticisms sometimes leveled at those of us in the sports world
Yeah.
advocating for principles of ecological psychology. Often, oh, you've got no evidence base, this, that, and the other. And I genuinely find that really quite frustrating. And so I genuinely think this has made a massive contribution to those of us in sports world, because we've got a lot more to talk to, but in a way that's kind of what's the word? Approachable. I could talk about some of these experiments to friends of mine in coaching world, and they get them, and they would understand it. So anyway, well done, great, I love it.
Well, thank you. I mean, I
Yeah,
can't say that we were
thanks.
like actively reaching towards the sports world when we were doing it, but we were actively reaching towards that exact idea, though, where somebody wants to do this, they're interested in it, they're frustrated with what they have been doing, they want to try something else, but they just need an entry. They need some way in that is understandable. We've told this story, I mean, probably 100 times, Jeff and I, about how we when we were writing the book, the goal was to be able to write a book that I could hand to my mom so that she would know what I did for a living. Right. Like she's a very bright woman. But she's educated in a completely different field. She's an artist. And I wanted to be able to say, all right, here to my mom, the artist, read this and then you will understand my field. So whenever we were writing it, we were sort of passing it back and forth. That was the biggest note we frequently gave each other, right? Was you got to mom this part up. Moms are confused, right? And so for exactly the reason that you're talking about, to make it accessible, right?
You're right, we weren't shooting for a sports or coaching audience, but boy, did we hit that audience. We had people reach out to us. We had
Yeah.
uh, football coaches reach out to us, basketball coaches reach out to us for a while. We worked with the baseball coach,
Yeah.
helping him develop practice plans. We've met with martial arts coaches. I was floored by all these people who found value, that kind of value. It wasn't really the audience we were expecting to find value, but great. I'm glad they did.
I remember we got an email from one it was a martial artist, right? So it wasn't the coach, it was the guy he was coaching. And he said our book is the first book he ever completed, right? It was the only book that he's ever read all the way through. Okay. I think it's Fred. It's Fred that does it.
Yeah, it's definitely Fred. You want to know what's going on. I was actually reading the other day, reading the bit about Fred doing the playing the game with the controller with Benoit taking his controller away. I love that bit. That was like a little soap opera, that one. I'm like,
That was Jeff's. That's a good one.
Well, I had a professor when I was in college who tried to write some fiction, and he said he had to stop because the characters kept doing things without telling him. And that's kind of how I felt about Fred. We were writing this book, and I was like, "Oh, well, I guess it turns out Fred likes to do this. Oh, okay.
He's
Well,
afraid
let's
of
go with
bees
it."
now.
Yeah, well, he jousts. Okay, Fred, you tell me, what is you want to do?
I forgot
So,
about the jousting.
Yeah.
That one really took me by surprise, the jousting.
Oh, me too. I invented Fred back in grad school. So Michael Turvey we all had to take this teaching class on how to make things understandable. And I invented Fred as a teaching tool way back then. And he did not have anywhere near this kind of personality or he sat in front of a tree most of the time, right? That's sort of all Fred did. And then one of the things that was really fun during this was discovering he jousts, and he's got a whole competition going with his neighbor's son who's always leaving his skateboard out, and just discovering all these sort of fun things about Fred it was a lot of fun.
I did notice actually as you read through the book, Fred's capers become more and more kind of outlandish, and other characters come into the play. So you could
I
see
know what you're
how
talking
you were starting to. Well, I felt like you were exploring Fred's landscape of affordances more and more.
about.
Fred was just
Absolutely.
telling us who he was,
Right, little by
and
little.
and one of the things we did, this is just as an aside, the
Easter egg.
the uh, the secondary characters are all named after luminaries in ecological psychology. So when Fred plays video games, he's playing against his friend Benoit, who is named after Benoit Bardee, who's a very well-known movement scientist.
Yeah.
Got it.
And
Got it.
the cheeky blighter who lives next door is Michael, after Michael
Ah,
Turner. And
oh, I see. I get it. I get it. And what about Fred's crush? Who's that represented
his
by?
Carol,
Carol,
Carol?
after Carol Shaw.
Ah, right.
No,
Got it. Got
Carol
No, not
Fowler.
Carol Shaw. Sorry, Carol
Fowler.
Fowler. Yes. Sorry.
it.
Who's Carol Shaw? See, this is
I don't
Fred
know.
again doing his thing.
Doing his thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was just thinking of Jeff Shaw and Bob Shaw is what I was thinking, because Bob's in there
Uh,
too. Bob is the physicist friend who lets the ice cube melt on the counter. Bob
Oh
Shaw.
yeah. Yeah. Right, we probably need to talk about some of these because actually
okay.
otherwise we're I mean we know obviously these are good teasers and it encourages people to
Let's do
get the
it
book.
then. Let's go.
But it's interesting. Can I want to jump in with something because it's actually one of the later chapters or the later sections, and you presented something that for me was like something I've been kind of playing around with in my head as a way of explaining the difference. So I'll just very quickly tell you a very quick story. So there was a recent, I guess it was a bit of a debate. So it seems to me anyway that the grappling and BJJ world there's a lot of people who are all in when it comes to the ecological approach. And but the interesting thing about the grappling world is, as I'm understanding more and more of, is it's extremely combative, as you'd expect, I suppose. And so the camps are now formed, and there is, quite a lot of tension. Anyway, so this debate, very
Sure.
quite well known fitness YouTuber, a guy called Mike Israetel, who is also a BJJ enthusiast and um, very, he's a exercise scientist, really, really, kind of like fully into the science of it all. And he debated a colleague, a friend of mine who's part of my learning group, a guy called Cal Jones, who's a judo coach recently. And there was a little bit of back and forward between the two of them, and there was almost this kind of impasse around. Mike could not get to grips with the idea that when we talk about information processing, which is obviously a kind of way of contrasting the two approaches, And by the way, I like the way you guys, with your lists, actually map out the contrasting approaches of the traditional approaches, which we might need to get onto. But they have this debate, and Mike was like, "Yeah, but the brain is involved, right? The brain's involved. Like there is information processing going on, right? So why would you sort of create this like sort of dichotomy?" And I was thinking about it, and then something later on occurred to me, which is to say, "Yeah, but there is something going on. The brain is involved, but not in the way we used to think, or not in the way most people think. It's in a different way."
Yeah.
And I've got some different ways of explaining that. But I wonder if I could just invite you both um, to maybe just sort of like set out the argument really around sort of the traditional views of perception, action, etc., and then the what you present in the book and what the ecological research basically is sort of articulating. Don't know
Sure.
who wants to go first.
Sure. I mean, we've got this down, right? Because we're forever having to give the elevator
Yeah,
pitch,
yeah,
right? And more than that, I teach sensation and perception now. I work at a university and I teach this, so I teach this to my undergrads. But the classic view of perception starts with a critical assumption, which is that the world needs to be copied in the head in order for us to do stuff. Right. So for me to reach out and pick up my water glass, I need to first copy that water glass in my head. And then I can make a motor program to reach out and pick up that water glass. But the problem is that when you treat that water glass or the properties of that water glass from physics variables, which is what we assume would be involved in picking up a glass, you start seeing that we're like really bad at copying those variables. And so we end up with this imperfect copy of the world. And then all of perception is about trying to make that copy good enough to use. And then they just never really get there. So ecological starts over and says that first assumption was nonsense. We do not need to copy the world in our head in order to interact with the world. We can just go ahead and interact with the world. You don't need to make a copy in order to make a motor program in order to do this thing. You can just reach out and pick up that glass, provided we make some different assumptions, right? One of which is that we're not separate from the environment and you can't understand us separate from the environment. It's all of a piece and it's all this dynamically evolving, set rather than these individual pieces that sort of have to be smashed together, right? And so ecological focuses on not the like copy in the head and therefore not about the processing of the brain, but rather about that interaction between organism and environment. Right. So the focus is there rather than on the what is happening to the thing inside. So you were talking about people saying, okay, well, what does the brain do then? What does the brain do? And it's not that I don't think the brain is interesting. It's just sort of beside the point, right? The point is the interaction between me and my environment, and the brain is only part of that. It's not the whole of it. So,
Yeah, so the it has to do with assumptions that underlie the approach and the reason why. So this assumption of separateness is really key in the traditional approach. That in our experience, we sort of feel like we're separate from our environment. Like there's me, and then there's not me, and the stuff that's not me has to get into me for me to know that stuff, right? How can I possibly I'm separate from from my surroundings, yet I know the surroundings. How is that possible? Well, somehow it has to get to me or in me. That's the copies that Julie was referring to. And one of the fundamental assumptions of ecological psychology is that separateness is not true. It's a myth. So instead of having separate animal and environment, it's a unified system. And if the animal environment system is the starting point rather than having two separate components, then nothing needs to be sent, nothing needs to be received. Perceiving is not it's not a communication between the environment and me. The copies don't need to be made. And instead, it's a relationship. It's a relationship of knowing.
yeah.
And to establish that relationship, an animal just has to be sensitive to stimulation patterns that are informative about its relationship. And that's a
Hmm.
very different problem than trying to figure out how rays of light get in the eye and make a copy that needs to then be, you know, decoded by the brain. And so the brain's job is not to decode the copy, but instead just sort of maintain this relationship
Yeah.
between the animal and the environment and guide its behavior. And um, you know, it's just not in charge. It's part of the system,
Right.
and you know, it's just not the computer that we tend to think it is.
Yeah. I was actually just talking about this with my students about how the classic view of the brain is this very linear and hierarchical processing machine, right? So you have sort of these inputs that are small and meaningless, and out of small and meaningless inputs, you have to build up into something complex and meaningful, right? That's the classic view of perception in the brain. And so that's where the research assumes that you're going to do that, right? You're going to go step, 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 step. Oh, now I have a tree, right? It was like I had spots of light, and then eventually somewhere down the line, now I have a tree. And so the research on the brain was done with those assumptions in mind. So they found things based on those assumptions. But when you make sort of different assumptions about the way that the brain works, so for example, instead of it being a linear processing machine, you instead think of it as a dynamic system that comes to, things are emergent properties of it, right? So our consciousness is an emergent property, our awareness of the world is an emergent property. Then you don't have these like individual processing units. You instead have a whole lot of things kind of working at once, and out of that, that relationship is being maintained. So it's like on the one hand, like a lot more complex because it's sort of a strange wooey idea of like, oh, well, it all just emerges. But at the same time, it ends up being quite a lot more simple. You don't have to go through all these like processing units and all of this step-by-step stuff that is very hard to pin down in the brain, probably because it isn't happening. And instead imagine it as a system that evolves dynamically over time. Right.
Yeah, the brain, another, and I was just building off something that Julia said, treating it as a machine will get you
Mm,
exactly this information processing approach.
yes.
But it's not, if it's not a machine and it's a system, then what makes a system different than a machine is the relationships. Because a machine you can take apart, it's context independent, it doesn't really matter, it does what it does independently of where it is and what it's connected to. And the system, the connections are what create the system.
Yeah.
Um, and so it doesn't, you can't look at it the same way. It's like, my lungs are part of my respiratory system, an important part of a respiratory system. If I didn't have my lungs, I wouldn't have a respiratory system, but my lungs don't do respiration. They're just a part of they are an important necessary component, but they don't do it.
Yeah.
What does it? Well, the pieces
The
together.
whole
It's like,
thing.
okay, yeah. So what does my brain is a part of my cognitive system. Is it, am I glad that I have a brain? Absolutely. But is it the thing that does the cognition? Not really.
And
I
so lovely. I mean, and in the sports world, you know, the traditional approach to learning sports and learning sports skills and participating in sports, I think, well, largely borrowed from the traditional approach because it sought to break sports down into movements,
Yeah.
techniques, and then reassemble them in context when you've got all of the environmental variables in place.
Right.
And the assumption being that that would magically translate into sports skill. And
Right.
my experience as a coach for a good 15 years and frustration was when that didn't happen, like it was the athlete's fault. And it really wasn't their fault. It was my fault. And it wasn't really my fault. It was the people who educated me's fault. But
Sure.
anyway, that was why I went on a journey. But it's so dissatisfying. It's well, no, it's so unsatisfactory, and it then boiled the sports experience down into right. Well, what you got to do is now because we've got to do sport in its component parts. and we've got to take away all the variability because that's actually noise that just gets in the way, right? So we've got to get that down into its component part, and we're going to work in isolation, and then we're going to move towards complexity.
Yeah.
And this still, by the way, this is like people will argue with me for hours and hours and hours that they are absolutely right about this, or at the very least, they will argue something around compatibility, which I do want to come on to. Anyway, but the problem I have with that, you see, is, and this is where some of my ethical stuff comes in, is that what we've done then is we've said, right, okay, children, we want you to be physically active and get involved in sport and get all the health benefits from that. Right. And when they come and have their first go, they're in a queue and they're waiting for their turn to do something that doesn't equate the sport whatsoever, is not really that enjoyable, isn't actually that good for them. And all of a sudden, we're like, what are we doing here? So
Yeah.
for me, ecological psychology and its influence in the sports space, because I've worked in policy making as well, around policy, directing the policy for coach development and coach education across England. I'm like, we need to start to bring some of this thinking in, because if our goal is to help young people be physically active and to enjoy sport and physical activity, and we know that lots of them aren't enjoying it, 45%, we did a survey, 45% of children in England said they didn't really enjoy sport that much. So the kids were doing sport, didn't really enjoy it. And then we're trying to encourage more into this really quite impoverished experience. So the
Yeah.
only way we can do that, really, if we're going to spend all this time and energy and money, is to try and get young people to be physically active, is to make it the best experience possible. And lo and behold, the vast majority of coaches are working from the wrong assumption around how they should be exposed to it. So
Yeah.
it's really important work, I think.
Yeah, again, not an aspect of it that crossed our minds, I think, when we were writing the book, but I'm delighted to hear that it can help in that way. Because yeah, I mean, I had exactly that experience when I was doing sports as a kid, because I was into baseball because my dad was into baseball, and so I got into baseball, and it was exactly the same. You walk up to the tee, you hit the ball, then it's somebody else's turn to walk up to the tee and hit the ball, or you stand in a line and they hit you a ground ball and you pick up the ground ball and you throw it to them, and then you go back to the back of the line, and that's not fun. That's not an interesting way to do it, and it also, according to our theory, isn't going to result in. So the reason why it would make sense from a traditional view is because, remember, the goal of getting the copy in the head was then you could make a motor program. And motor programs are made up of individual units of movement. And so the idea was, if you could like train them on those like individual units over and over and over and over again, then when they went to go do that individual unit as part of a thing, oh, then suddenly you can hit a baseball, right? Sorry, my son just got home from school. Um, but that just doesn't work in an ecological perspective. Instead, you need to explore the space. So you should be doing all kinds of crazy movements and seeing what happens when I throw the ball straight up as opposed to throwing it over there, or any kind of variability rather than being noise, which is like a crazy making thing when I hear that. Instead of being noise, variability is the point. Variability is how we.
Variability. Andrew Wilson said to me, and on the podcast, and I say it all the time: variability isn't noise; it's signal.
Correct. Correct.
So I
Absolutely.
thought of two things while you guys were talking about this, and kind of recall them. Um, so practicing these sort of isolated movements does make you better, but at a very specific thing. And like you
Hmm.
were saying, when you change the context, and what you've learned is this movement in this context, you change the
Hmm.
context. Well, I can only do this movement this way. I can't do it that way. Um, it reminds me of a few years ago, there was a fad of these sort of brain training apps
Yeah.
where I don't know,
Oh,
it was
sure.
like, yeah, reaction time apps and this and that. And it turned out you got, and their dependent measure was, look, they got better on this on the app. You were improving all the way through your app, but that's
Sure.
the only thing you got good at. So it kind of reminds me of that. And it also made me think, my wife and I are watching this uh, nature documentary, and it was uh, forget what kind of um, predatory cat. It might have been tigers or something. But the point is, tigers learn to hunt not by practicing like particular movements in the hunt, right? They don't like the mother lion doesn't line up the cubs and say, okay, everybody practice this movement and this movement and this movement. The cubs play with each other. Like they
Yeah.
attack each other. And that's the way they learn to hunt, by a smaller, compact version of low stakes version of the thing.
Or in my experience, they hunt my toes under my blanket.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I'm just wondering what lessons we might be able to learn from outside of the sport context of how other kinds of animals learn these complex, coordinated activities.
Yeah.
And not just coordinated in terms of an individual's behavior, but like a group, like it's a team effort. Like let's go as a team and do this thing together.
Yeah.
Well, I often say to people that before there were coaches and before there was the ability to analyze sports to the nth degree using video analysis and various other things, and before there were named movements, techniques, people did this. They did learn to do it somehow, So
Yeah.
they found ways of doing things. Famously, Dick Fosbury with a high jump found his own way of getting over a high bar that everybody then followed. But equally, that people have developed. Also, famously, I don't know how well you know the world of soccer, but there's a really famous footballer called Johan Cruyff who did a famous move where he sort of like he pretended he was going to cross the ball and then he pulled the ball back and behind his leg and then went a different direction. And apparently he'd never done that before until he did it in that moment because it seemed like the thing to do. At least that's the way he tells the story.
Sure.
And that's become known as the Cruyff turn. And now children are taught to do the Cruyff turn. And it's about what was it, 8 years ago, maybe something like that, where my own sport, I'm a field hockey coach, and my own sport, our talent pathway was entirely given over to information processing based ideas of skill acquisition.
Sure.
And we genuinely had children running up to cones and doing perfect movements with a high left elbow and using the stick and moving it. And anyway, I now have seen a generation of young people who do this perfect movement at completely the wrong time over and over again. Because, as I always say to people, what you learn in isolation, you have to relearn in context.
Yeah.
So when coaches say to me they've never got enough time, I always say, well, stop wasting it doing things that aren't going to be helpful.
Right? It's no good if
It's
they can get it into the net, but only if they're standing directly in front of it and having waited in line.
it is challenging because they do need to have some level of fundamentals, right? You kind of have to have a little bit of, well, this is how you hold the stick, and this is like there is technique involved.
Hmm.
But at some point you've got to transition, I think, from the those sets of behaviors to applying that technique, or maybe even removing the technique. And I'm just thinking about, the field hockey players, um, you know, you're saying have them go around cones and they do this perfect technique with their elbow up. What if, it reminds me of some of Rob Gray's research, but having them go around the cone with one hand on the stick or hopping or something. I mean, or something like that, where it's okay, I'm going to explore this space. I'm still doing it in a way that's allowed under the rules of the game, like your soccer
Right.
player, but I'm going to find a creative way. It's the constraints that that bring about the solution. That's what yields the creativity. That's where, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your footballer. It was a particular set of constraints at that time that led him to go, well, I'm going to have to do this.
Yeah.
So on that point of technique, actually, so one of the things that launched this podcast was I did my second ever episode was called The War on Drills. And it was basically a campaign I was launching to remove the sports world from the isolated, um, cues, waiting for your turn to do this isolated technique. It was basically saying, we can do better. And by the
Amazing.
way, there's a whole body of research out there suggesting that actually what we've been doing for a long time isn't actually that beneficial. But to your point about technique, Jeff, I've basically had a live experiment running. It's not by any means scientific, but it's as good as I can do in my field-based work. And basically, it involved my own son, who, from the age of about 8, or maybe a bit younger, like 7, I've been coaching with a cohort of young people in field hockey, and I have hardly ever, I have on occasion, but hardly ever taught them technique, and I did it deliberately. I put a constraint on myself because, like, I'm all about that. That's what I'd learned to do, right? And most of us as coaches, we've got all this knowledge about technique, and all we want to do is put it in and give people that knowledge and show them how to do things. So I deliberately constrained myself and said, right, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to create environments that enable exploration, and I'm going to manipulate those environments using constraints in order to attract towards different movement possibilities. And for quite a long time, we lost every game. Because we didn't have some of the techniques. Mm-hmm. But what we did do was adapt. So what we did do, because in field hockey, in case you don't know, it's not like ice hockey where you can use both sides of the stick. You can only use one side, the flat side. The rounded side is illegal, so you have to turn the stick over. Quite a strange move until you learn to do it. So, but you can still play. It means you're sort of a bit more limited in terms of your ability to manipulate the ball, but you can still do it. So if you've got that constraint in place where you can't manipulate the ball and move it, what can you do? Well, you can pass it. Or you can, and your teammates can coordinate with you and you can move the ball into. And I noticed this happening, and I know this is all massive confirmation bias, and I know what I was looking for, I'm looking to see, and this, that, and the other, because I'm working under these assumptions. But I just thought I'll do this because it's interesting. And I did notice this. So what I noticed was this group of players with these constraints on technique, their adaptation was, how do we coordinate to make up for our technique limitations? And after a while, through a process of observation and natural kind of exploration, their own techniques emerged as to how they could manipulate the ball. And they all did it slightly differently. Some of them did it this way, some did it this way, and some did it the other way around with their hands the other way around. It's all fine. We can play with that and we can explore it. And through this journey, I will get to the end of this story. I did tell you I'm not very good.
That's all right. I'm fascinated, please.
Through this journey that we've been on together, what has emerged is a group of individuals who have superpowers. And some of them have got superpowers that I would never have been able to teach them, because they do things that I would never even know to teach them. The game has changed as we've gone, and new rules have emerged where you can do different things. You can now hit the ball in different ways, and they've all learned that. And some of them are better at hitting the ball on that side than they are the traditional side, which wasn't available to me. And it's really interesting to see how actually not deliberately not utilizing technique but one of the things I've noticed with all of them, and I get a lot of feedback from others, is their game appreciation is extremely high. And I put that down to not being taught technique early, so that all they want to do is use their techniques kind of semi-selfishly, because boys can often do that when they're like 8 and 9 and 10. They had to coordinate, and they learned about how they work together in the game to solve the problem. And then as the techniques came in later, they then started to then win everything, and they were unstoppable. So it was a really interesting experiment. And again, I'm conscious that I basically just told you a whole story about how I think the world's worked because I wanted it to work that way. But I genuinely feel, and I've had others tell me, that this has happened with this particular cohort. And here's the most important thing: they're all still playing.
Well, it's because you made them into superheroes.
They did that. All I did was create an environment for them to explore within.
Right, but that's what I mean is that I think that when you expect everybody to look exactly the same,
Yeah,
you do get people who go, well, I don't fit that mold, and so I can't possibly do this, and I don't want to do this anymore. Right?
yeah,
But you allowed them to be themselves, and I think that that to me was the thing that stood out the most in that story is allowing people to explore their own dynamics and their own bodies in that space. You get people who are very good at this thing or very good at that thing, or they find their own way of doing it that's completely different than somebody else because it works best for their body mechanics,
yeah.
and or body dynamics, I should say. And that to me, like we do that with like walking, talk about like a basic behavior. It's not like we break down walking into, well, first you're going to lift your foot like this, and then you're going to push it forward. We just let them all kind of stumble around until they figure it out. And
And everybody
everybody's
walks
gait,
differently.
that's right. And everybody's
Yeah.
gait's a little different because it works best for their body. And you did that, but in a more complicated sphere. It's the same idea. Just let them stumble around for a while, and they're going to fall down a lot, and they're going to be terrible at it for a little while. And then they're going to find their own dynamics in that space and turn into superheroes. And I love that.
It also makes me think of some of these complex behaviors that emerge from very simple sets of rules, like the flocking behavior,
Yes.
where you get these complex patterns of multiple of dozens of insects or birds or schooling behaviors and fish, and it's just one or two parameters that need to be programmed in. And I'm thinking about that in terms of sport because any sport has its own, the constraints are there in terms of the rules of the game, right? So in field hockey, the ball cannot go outside of this area, right? There's a boundary. You, a goal is defined in this way. There are only so many players on the field at this time, and there's probably other rules as well. But those are like, and then when you have play unfolding with those sets of rules, you might find these creative solutions that they're okay, well, given those sets of rules, how would you get the ball from here to there? And how, given these sets of rules, and it's not the movements themselves. And again, there's this trade-off because, it, but the movements themselves don't need to be specified. The rules are specified. And in the context of those rules, achieving a given end, given these rules,
Right.
can be done lots of ways. And I think that's the moral of your story with these creative solutions that your players were finding.
Yeah.
And if I would start most sessions where they would um, play 1v1 tag style games, but with a stick and a ball. So they get lots of opportunities to manipulate the ball. And actually, if I use a very simple constraint, then or create new rules in the game, and I very often would call it levels. So I'd say, right, you're ready to go to level 2. Are you ready to go to level 3? And
Excellent.
then we bring in a new constraint and a new challenge. And then that what that does is that creates, well, it attracts to different different solutions,
Yeah.
which then ask them to do different things with the stick and the ball, which then they have to then work on how to do. So a very simple example was if you can't turn your back on your opponent, you've got to manipulate in different ways. So I create all these different types of rules and guide so that they have but the main thing for me was always to have an opponent because at the base level of the
Mm.
game,
You always
the
do.
fundamental information needs to be that there's someone else trying to stop you doing what you need to do in
Yeah.
some way, and your solution should be at least in part defined by what they're doing,
Yeah.
rather than it always be I'm just going to do my thing, so I'm going to do my move. Well, what
Yeah.
happens if they do this? Well, they're going to get you, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm gonna maneuver the ball around a cone that's not going anywhere, that's not trying to stop me, that's not trying, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think you've highlighted one of the most important parts of teaching it this way is the adaptability, right? If you do things in static circumstances, then when the circumstances change, you're lost. But if you do things in dynamic circumstances where the circumstances are always changing, then the circumstances change. Well, that's just another Tuesday, you
Yeah.
know?
Can I ask you? I wanted to just sort of get into a couple of the bits in the book actually, because there's some areas that I'm
Yeah.
really fascinated by. So I'm currently writing a book, or I'm helping to edit a book, all about ecological approaches to different sports.
Mhm.
And I've pulled together a load of different coaches who are basically just talking about, how the approaches they take. So trying to make it quite practitioner-led, targeted at actually kind of year one undergraduate coaching students, so that it talks about, use of constraints and stuff. But one of the things I want to present in that, so we use, there's a fairly strong body of like work around what's called the constraints-led approach within sport, which you'll be aware of, obviously. And CLA's been around a long time, and I don't know if I like it anymore. I'm interested in your thoughts on this, and you've got a few chapters that really speak to this for me. The reason I don't like it anymore is what has tended to happen is that in the world of coaching is people go, oh God, yeah, we've been doing constraints for ages. It's nothing new. We've done conditioned games. And those conditioned games might be something like this. You're only allowed to touch the ball twice. So one to control it, one to pass it. That's a conditioned game, right? So that is, we often refer to that as constraining to constrain, right? What if the choice is to run with the ball, right? Like, oh, you're too constrained, right? Now there might be an argument to do it, but it's for different reasons. And the problem you've got is the word constraint makes people think of condition, makes people think of, so lots of people who've done conditioned games using a traditional approach, and they
Mhm.
think they're doing a CLA, and then they call the CLA old wine in new bottles. I'm like, whoa, the fundamental assumptions behind the CLA are completely different about why you use constraints. So I kind of want to change the language a little bit, and I actually want to talk more about an affordance-led approach.
Sure.
Because I think my coaching has tried to be as much as possible affordance-led. So what are the properties of the environment and the invitations to action that we want to draw attention, more or less attention to? It can be a really wide landscape, it can be a very narrow one. And then how do we use constraints in order to draw towards those affordances?
Sure.
But the starting point of the affordances, what is present in the environment that we want that we want to maintain full visibility of. And obviously the book speaks to that in lots of different places. And I'd just be interested to please, take me there, take me into the book and talk to me about those areas. But I'd just love to sort of have a bit of a conversation with you about what you think of that as a construct, and then what within the book kind of speaks to that a little bit.
Mm. I'm not sure I understand the difference between the constraints-based approach. I'm sorry, I'm showing my ignorance of sports right now. Could you give me a primer real quick?
Well, no, it's good. I mean, I'm glad because I'm in many respects, I'm hoping that you're going to tell me I'm completely off my rocker and maybe I should just put this idea back in the
Yes or no?
box. But what I mean is, so to give you an example, very often when people are using constraints, what they're doing is they're putting a constraint into an environment in order to bring about a different movement choice. So very often they get trapped into this idea of, oh, they're not doing what I wanted them to do. So I'm going to use a constraint to make them do what I wanted them to do. And
Okay.
I feel very uncomfortable about that approach because that to me feels like you're just going down the conditioning world.
Yeah.
Whereas an affordance-led approach, this is just a change of language. Affordance says, no, actually, there's a range of movement possibilities,
Yes.
and there's a problem to be solved, which is presented by the environment and the problems that the environment is presenting and the opportunities for action that it presents. And what we can do with a group or an individual is enable them to do some exploration in that space, and then we can narrow the search space down or open it up,
Right.
depending on how well they're getting on trying to solve the problem. But what we shouldn't be doing is constraining to bring about certain idealized movements, or at least I don't think we should.
I was just going to say, it sounds like conditioning, but with extra steps. Like it just sounds like doing the same sort of drill thing, but this time I'm not going to tell you what the drill is. You have to guess it, right? I mean, again, I'm probably showing my ignorance about sports here. Like I'm not, this is not my world, but it just seems, and again, it sort of seems like it's taking away the best part of this other thing that we were talking about before, which is taking away the creativity in solving a goal, right?
Yeah.
So it should be about the goal. It should be about the thing that you're trying to achieve. It should be about, can I get the ball from here to here, not can I do this kick? Because I mean, maybe you can do that kick, maybe you can't, but can you get the ball there is more important for winning the game. I think. I'm pretty sure. I mean,
It,
not a sports ball enthusiast,
depending
but I'm
on your
pretty sure.
sport, yeah.
Right, depending on the sport. But it's like, so if we're talking about football or soccer, right? The goal is to get the ball in the net. That's the goal. And so it doesn't matter if you use this special kick or this special technique or you move in exactly the right way. It matters if you get the ball in the net, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
focusing on the movement feels like we're looking at the wrong thing again.
And that's what I was going to say. If the constraints are in place to produce a particular kind of movement, then it's the wrong kind of constraint. If the
Right,
constraints are in place to ensure a particular outcome, that's a different story.
right,
Yeah, so
right.
what I'm trying to argue is that we're not going to be led by the constraints, we're going to be led by the affordance. The
Yeah,
constraints are used to support the athlete in their search because some athletes don't perceive the landscape the same way.
yeah,
And so what so for example, if let's say we've got a game going on and there's a 5v5 game, and actually what we're looking to try and do is we're looking to try and encourage to try and find a way a way through, not over in due soccer, to way through a group.
yeah.
Well, there are gaps that appear or don't, and they're momentary and they flex. So we have to draw attention to those. So we'd use constraints as a way to draw attention to those,
Mhm.
as opposed to saying, I want, to constrain it down so that, and the natural way to do that would be to say, for example, oh, the opposition aren't allowed to move. They have to stay still. So the gaps are always there and you can use them. No, 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 no. So this is the point. You're wanting people to attune to the properties in the environment which are fleeting.
Yeah,
You don't want to artificially create properties that
yeah.
wouldn't be fleeting because otherwise you're not learning about the fleeting nature of those properties in that
Right,
example.
right, absolutely. Yeah, so like I said, it just sounds like conditioning with extra steps. So
So I one thing I wanted to talk to you about because I'm obviously involved in a sport that has implements stick. So you've got a lovely piece that I want you to talk about, which is where you talk about Fred
Jeff plays
playing
hockey.
his video game called Humunculus: The Infinite Regress. I'm imagining that is an actual video game.
Oh
It
no,
is not.
not
No,
at
it's
all.
not.
No,
Oh, I wish it
no, the
was.
infinite regress is one of we didn't end up, I think, talking about it in the book, but it's one of the philosophical troubles with having a central executive. Is that you've
Oh,
got, well, if you've got the central executive is running the show, then who's running the central executive? Well, he's got to have a central executive. Well, then who's running that central executive? Well, he's got to have one, and so on forever.
I
Called the
kind of
infinite
thought it
regress.
was and I thought it was a kind of a nod to that, but I figured that must be a game. Someone needs to have invented that game, surely.
Nope.
No.
And the
But I would
hero
play
in
that game.
that game was Sverker, named after Sverker Runeson, who's
That's right.
another luminary. Anyway, I continue playing the game.
Yep.
So yes. So anyway, yes. So Fred's got his controller that he likes, and he's controlling Sverker really well, and having a really good time. And he's at one. He's at one with his controller, and
Yeah.
then Benoit, his scheming
Sneaky
friend,
buddy.
realizes this controller is better than Benoit's controller,
Yeah.
and pretend and suggests to Fred that his crush
Mm.
Carol was outside. Fred goes to look for Carol. Carol's not there, but in the meantime,
Yes.
Benoit, the schemer, has switched over the controllers, and then Fred is playing with this bad controller and he's all discombobulated. So much so
Yeah.
that Benoit feels sorry for him in the swap back, which is a lovely, nice finish to the story. But anyway, this notion of um, oneness with a implement and the sense of the field. And now I'm with you, right? I can literally pick up a field hockey stick
Yeah.
and I'll tell you whether it's going to be any good or not. I couldn't tell you why. I couldn't tell you how, but I could. And that really spoke to me about that. And I've really wanted to speak to some people who can tell me about implements and how important they are and
Yeah.
the sensations you have and haptics and everything else. So I'd just love to riff on that for a bit if
There
you'd be
was
so kind.
Sure. There was a whole series, I mean, keeping with the sports theme, there was a whole series of research studies on baseball players and also tennis players about where the sweet spot on a tennis racket is, right? So, if you hit the ball at just the right spot on the tennis racket, it doesn't vibrate in your hand because all of the energy gets put into the ball and the ball will go better and further and, with more accuracy. And tennis players can pick up a racket and immediately sense, oh, well, that's where that sweet spot is. And the same thing with a baseball bat, right? It's got a sweet spot. And so people who play enough baseball can do that as well. But the thing is that we do this with everyday objects too. You think about, taking notes. You pick up a pencil and you're so used to picking up a writing implement that you don't really think about that as being, well, I'm picking up a tool and I'm using this as a tool. It just becomes an extension of you, right? Immediately and naturally, it just becomes that extension. So you can do something like write on your piece of paper and explore that piece of paper with the end of the pen and know everything about the paper and what you can do with it just by exploring it with the pen instead. So it's in sports, but it's in like literal every day as well.
It's about where your awareness is. And in playing field
Yeah.
hockey, and Julia mentioned I play ice hockey. Your awareness is at the end of the stick when you're using it. And because it's incorporated, it's become a part of you. You are now perceiving the ball by means of how it is affecting the stick, and you are subject to those mechanical disturbances through the stick. And your awareness is at the end of the stick.
Yeah.
And that's and if that were to change, then that sort of system, it's a person plus object system that you've created. It's like these systems dynamics we were talking about earlier. If your awareness is suddenly shifted, then the system is broken down, and that's what happened to Fred in his game when all of a sudden his actions are not creating the outcome he was expecting,
Right.
and it feels now he's aware that he's holding this device in his hands, and that's what would happen if you have a bad field hockey stick or a stick that isn't doing what you want. It would feel like you're holding a stick instead
Mhm.
of I'm
Extension.
manipulating the ball. Instead,
Right.
you're feeling like you're manipulating a stick. You,
Right.
you feel what's in your hand rather than what's at the end of the stick. And I was thinking about something else along those lines. You have the same experience with your own body. You are not, you sometimes you are aware of your body, but that's sort of a disconcerting experience.
Mhm.
So I'm talking and making all these movements with my vocal tract in my face, but if I were to like stop and be aware of my face, the whole thing would break down because what I'm aware of is the outcome, not of the movements.
Right.
And so it's the same thing, same conversation we were having before about the the outcome being important rather than the movements themselves. And so
Right.
when you're manipulating an object, it's not about what you're doing with the object, it's about the effect you're having with that object.
Right.
And that's what you become aware of. It just becomes,
So
it becomes incorporated into you. It becomes a part of you and the means by which you are perceiving and acting.
this is making me think of the Bernstein hammering study. The repetition without repetition. You look at somebody hammering over and over again, and expert hammerers don't hammer the same way every time. Expert hammerers strike the nail every time, but they don't move the hand because you can't. I mean, like the breeze comes out of the east instead of the west for a moment, and all of a sudden you've got a slightly different scenario, or you start your arm in a slightly different place, or your arm's just a little more tired than it was a minute ago, and so you've got a completely different set of constraints. You can't possibly hammer exactly the same way every single time, but you can hit the nail every time, right? And so it becomes about controlling the goal rather than controlling the bits that get you into the goal.
Yeah.
You're learning how to
100%.
control the device or the implement to achieve the goal. It would be
Right,
like, driving your friend's car that doesn't quite move the way your car
right.
moves. And so it feels like it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like
An
things don't
extension of you.
move the way you think they're going to move when you do the things you're doing, just like
Right.
Fred in the game.
It's interesting. There's so many areas that really resonates for me. I mean, the writing thing. I mean, I've got this pen. I really like this pen. It's just the right
Right.
weight. It's just the right
Hmm.
size. It
Hmm.
writes very smoothly. And if I pick up another pen now and start writing with it, I can't write as well because it's scratchy and not nice and the weight's not as
Not
good
my
and
good
all those
pen.
sorts of things. But that's kind of like one of those imperceptive things that you wouldn't know until you know. It's really, really interesting. My
Sure.
son's been really struggling with his field hockey. He can't strike the ball on one side particularly well. We could not work out why. I've got a whole video of me working with him, and we did a whole piece around. We did like various constraints, and we did some differential learning, and we were trying to discover different ways that he might want to try and attack the ball, and where his
Mm.
attention was, and all these sorts of things. And none of it seemed to make much impact. And then we discovered something the other day actually about the design that was really interesting. So he's got this particular stick with a particular design. It's very similar to an ice hockey stick. Oh, and by the way, Jeff, you play hockey. You're in trouble now. So I work with USA Ice Hockey, and all their coach education is really focused on the ecological approach. They listen to this podcast, and I wouldn't be surprised if you'll be getting a call.
So
I
cool.
I I coached my son for several years while he was playing, and we followed this developmental model. And
Yeah,
yeah, and so I could see that it was much more enlightened than some of the other kinds of ways of coaching. So I was quite impressed. We can come
I was
back
at
to that,
there
but I
Yeah. Yeah. Wait.
a year
So your
ago. I was
son's
at there.
stick, it was different somehow.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'll get back to that. Yeah,
yeah, we'll
sorry.
come
I,
back
I
to this.
digressed
Yeah.
myself.
That's
Yeah.
the end of the story.
Sorry, yeah. So he's got a stick that's made it's similar to an ice hockey stick. It's designed with a curve in the body of the stick to enable him to generate a lot of power when he flicks. So when he strikes, but when he flicks, it's like it gets like a slingshot action.
Hmm.
Very, very normal to ice hockey, very normal. And but that bend means that when he tries to hit it, the thing goes flying up in the air. So he's learned to adapt by kind of putting his hands way in front to keep the thing on the ground so that he can hit the ball to other people, but also so he can shoot. And I
Uh-huh.
got this thing in my hands and said, "Oh, it can't be about that. Let me have a go." And the thing nearly flew over. We were doing it in our back garden. It nearly flew over and smashed into the neighbor's fence. And I was like, "Oh my God, how can you even play with this thing?" And it's like it's interesting how I needed to do this. I can't
Yeah.
swap it in the game. So,
Yeah.
but when it comes to shooting, I'm going to have to. So we're now in a bit of a. So we're now having to think about: do we play with weight? Do we move around? But then there's a whole rabbit hole now around the implement and how we can adapt it to make it help him hit it.
Or get him a different one.
Well,
Get
that's
him one
what
that
I
can
want to
do
do, but
that.
he's like, no, 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 I need it for this particular because the particular flicking action he does is when he score all the goals, right? It's just too big
Yeah.
an
I
attractor,
get it.
Julia.
I get it. Of course. Of course. No, I get it entirely. That makes perfect sense. That's so interesting. You hear these stories of people doing exactly this sort of thing. They had something as a kid and they had to overcome that, right? So, like, there's a story of a baseball player who he was always wearing his brother's batting gloves, but they were too big for him. So he always had to tighten up um, the straps at the big right before he hit. Every time before he hit, he had to tighten up the straps. Of course, now he's like a famous baseballer. He can buy all the gloves that he wants, and they fit him perfectly. But every time before he goes to go up to bat, he adjusts the straps of his thing. And so it's like, you've got him, he's locked into the dynamics of this one stick. So he's putting his hand in a funny place. And I wouldn't be surprised if you gave him a new stick, if he'd just be putting his hand in that same space because he was so used to the dynamics of that stick.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I think we should get him a different stick.
Um,
You should
what
make him
one
try.
thing, one thing I was going to say, I was going to ask you about as well is, um, obviously in team games, the interactions between the players to coordinate and
Hmm.
the interactions with opponents are obviously key. So our opponents largely, to a certain extent, what they're doing is something that's interesting to us. We need to be aware of what they're doing so that we can find ways to solve that problem. Because if they mass in a certain place, they flock in a certain place, we need to flock in a different place or interact with a different place. And likewise, how we coordinate, how we space, and all those sorts of things have become important. So you mentioned flocking, liberations of starlings, and there's a lot of stuff like that. But you talked a lot about you talked about interpersonal
Mm,
and intrapersonal interactions.
sure.
And I'd love to just sort of maybe just dwell on that a little bit more and get you guys to sort of talk a bit more about that. And because I'm really fascinated by that, because I'm not sure how much this has gone into the sort of wider ecological psychology world, but there's this notion that a lot of people are playing around with, which is a shared affordance.
Yeah.
So how do we design environments where people begin to interpret the space, the search space or the landscape in a similar way? They're following similar ideas about the ways in which we'll navigate. So I do a lot of design of environments to facilitate
Yeah.
this notion of a shared affordance. But I'm interested in these dynamics anyway, intra, inter, all of that stuff. So sorry, it's a big area to explore, but I just love to get you to open it up. I forgive me for just like going all over the place.
No, it's fine. It's not an area I know a ton about, but it makes me think of there's a series of studies on in sports in soccer, I think, about how moving with a partner. So they create virtual environments and you move with a partner to try and create an affordance essentially. And so it's the same idea. It's like you've got a shared landscape or a shared space with another person. And I think one of the earliest studies too is looking at them. I think we talked about this one in the book with the planks, right? And moving from holding the plank from one hand to two hands and from two hands to two people, right? Like that's another shared affordance. And you can do that with very minimal communication, right? You don't, yep, we can both see. We need this to both go do this. So that's what that makes me think of. But Jeff probably knows more.
Um, well, you made me think of some studies that I've done on soccer where people were they were perceiving the minimum distance through which they could kick a ball, depending on whether the things that comprise that gap were teammates or opponents or cones. And there's, as you might expect, they wanted a larger difference when the objects that made the space were opponents than if they were teammates. And if depending on how they were facing, if they were facing in as if they could intercept or facing away. I can send you that one when we're done here. Um, so in terms of intrapersonal coordination, so just coordinating yourself,
Yeah.
um, there are, what you're getting is the propagation of forces through the system, and the system, your um, musculoskeletal system is set up in such a way that that those forces arrange themselves and you undergo phase transitions from one kind of coordination to another, like from walking to running. As you get to a particular speed, you achieve now a new, as the constraints change, you've achieved a new coordination to better distribute those forces appropriately. In the case of interpersonal coordination, the same things can happen, but those forces then you have to be getting information about those forces. There has to be a stimulation pattern that is carrying that information across or between people. And I was thinking about um, another example on our book about the horse and around study.
Mm-hmm.
So, so if you have two people walking one in front of the other, but they just walk. They will walk and they will fall into a coordination. Um, but if you have them walk and hold a piece of foam so that the movements sort of carry back and forth as this person steps, it compresses the foam, which bumps the person in front, which causes
Mm-hmm.
them to walk a little differently, which compresses the foam, which causes the person at back to walk a little differently. Eventually, a coordination pattern emerges that as if they're a four-legged animal.
Yeah.
They're that walking pattern emerges naturally because it's the only way to sort of keep the system moving in a comfortable fashion.
Right.
But you can also get these phase transitions between people informationally. So one of the classic examples is that if you have if you move your fingers
Mm,
uh, one up and one down alternatingly, and you go fast enough, eventually they'll start moving together. You can get that same pattern between people. If you sit next to somebody and you swing a pendulum or you kick your legs,
right.
um, eventually you'll fall into an in
Mm,
phase pattern moving together. You're not connected with that person except for the stimulation patterns that are being
yeah.
structured by that person's movements and your movements to them. So I guess if you're trying to get a team, you want that team to be coordinated
Mhm.
together. They've got to have shared access to the same structured stimulation pattern. You've got to get them uh, attuned to be looking for the right thing at the right time.
It's
So you used a word there actually, and I'm going to ask Julie to talk about this a little bit. You used a word there that has caused quite a lot of controversy in the sports world, attunement.
Mm.
oh oh
So
dear.
I'd love to dwell on that a little as well.
Well, what I mean by attunement is um, developing a sensitivity to the stimulation pattern that is lawfully related to the property you're trying to perceive. It's almost like attunement, like, tuning an old-fashioned radio with dials. You're just trying to you're trying to become or develop sensitivity to the right stimulation pattern.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about in the book, I'm pretty sure we talk about in the book. It's been a while since I read it. But one of the things that we talk about too is that attunement is not just, there's a lot of pieces to it, right? I think the sun went down over there. You've been getting progressively darker.
Yeah, I put my light on.
Very good. There's the attunement to can I do this thing in this space, but there's also the necessary like getting your body to do it too, right? And so the idea that you would become attuned and that you'd never make a mistake is not that is nonsense. Like that isn't gonna be accurate because you still then need to get your body to do the thing. And and so I don't know. That was what was making me think of is that I think that when people hear the word attunement, they think of something other than what we mean, right? They think of it being like, oh, well, I'm just getting better at a skill, right? And we mean it in a perceptual sense, right? We mean it in a like Jess said, right? Becoming awareness of the information gradient, whatever it might be for this particular thing. But that's not the same thing as being like I might become aware of whether or not a goal would afford making for a soccer player, but I'm not going to be able to make that goal, right? Like that's not a thing I'm capable of doing, but I might be able to tell that that person could, right? That would be, I could become attuned to the affordance of goal making without actually having the ability to make the goal.
And I
Yeah,
think
or
if you're trying to teach a skill,
Right.
then what you need to get the person to learn about is not the movement, but the relationship between movement and the perceptual experience.
Right.
That's what they, and then from that, it reminded me of another study, the study from our book about uh, transfer, because that's really what practice is. You want to get
Right.
them to learn a skill that they can then take from here and put in here.
Right.
And this study was done in VR, and people learned that when they walked straight, they had to walk slightly to the left to get to a target that was straight ahead. That was the change in the VR. The VR made it look like they had to walk left to go straight, and then they were tested outside of VR and they were told to crawl to a target. And it turned out when they crawled, they also crawled to the left because they learned about this particular way the world looked, the optic flow pattern as they were moving. And so the world looks this way when I move this way, and therefore I need to move this way to get where I'm going. But if they were asked, when they were asked to throw a ball to a target, they didn't throw to the left because it had nothing to do with the relationship that they learned about during practice. It wasn't, they didn't learn a general rule
Right.
like go left to go straight. It was when I'm engaging in these specific behaviors because that's going to change how the world looks.
Yeah.
So,
Uh,
gosh, yeah. So it's about trying. That's becoming attuned to the right variable is the way to get performance to occur in
sure.
different contexts because the that relationship will transfer, even though if the movement won't.
Yeah. This
Mic
reminds
drop.
Yeah, I
me.
mean, well, I mean, it's I love that. I mean, and that's actually the key thing. This is one of the reasons why maintaining the fidelity of the environment, i.e., having the relevant factors at play and equating somehow. You can't always do the entire thing, but you're equating we talk often about taking a slice of the game and then exploring within that slice. It might be that the slices is a smaller pitch, it might be smaller numbers, it might be lots of different things, but we can still maintain the fidelity. The minute you remove that, you then impoverished it. And then somebody's then learning about some form of movement that won't equate. Interestingly, though, I'm interested because I'm interested in coaching coaches and I'm interested in how coaches learn. And I think there's a whole area to be explored around the ecological approach to coach learning and coach education, as opposed to the very traditional linear instructional approach that's taken. But
Right.
interestingly, when it comes to attunement, I 100% believe that if I can work in a particular way where I become extremely attuned to the experiences of the athletes, um, that's when real magic happens. And I've got no evidence, I've got no proof of this, but I feel that I've experienced flow as a coach 2 or 3 times. And it's when I've been completely immersed and attuned to
Mhm.
what they're doing. Very often the most challenging coaching sessions, but I'm totally immersed. And time stands still. And I'm like, oh, the session's over? What? Hey, what? Because we're so kind of in sync.
Yeah.
And I'm putting in place constraints and manipulations and engagement and all that sort of stuff. And the interesting thing about that was when I changed from thinking that it was all about my instruction and all about my praise and my this and my that, towards actually being a lot quieter and much more about using all of my senses like superpowers and listening and genuinely sensing and picking up from
Yeah.
what's happening, the little things that are going on, the interactions between the players that enables me then to become really immersed in their world. It feels to me like that's well, I am pretty addicted to that, so I'm pretty all in. But also, I'm searching for that level of engagement,
Yeah.
um, and I feel that it works best, certainly for me, and I hope for them when we work that way.
It just makes me think of pedagogy, so we're professors, we're both professors. This is the thing. I mean, and it's the same idea. The times that I have felt that I was doing the best job as a professor were always the times where I stopped thinking about me. I stopped thinking about my goal for the day. It was always about, the ones where I really was communing with my students the most, right? Where we started to feel like one system instead of me standing apart and like trying to stuff knowledge in their brains, like we're trying to come to a thing together. Those are always the best days. Those are always the ones where it feels the best. So I mean, it just reminds me of pedagogy in the same way. It's interesting to see it in this completely different arena. It's the same thing. Mm.
And I think part of the job of a coach, I think a good coach has got to try to find a way to take these complex relationships between how you move and what the world looks like these optic flow relationships I was describing in the VR, and put that into words, right? Or maybe not words, but make it understandable to an athlete to try to take, okay, here's what, and that might be the way to coach, I think, is not about what. the right movement is, but what things will feel like or look like when you did it right.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I know you'll know you did it right when it feels like, because it feels like this, like, I don't know, it probably feels the same with the field hockey stick, but if I hit the puck just right, it feels like it's not there. It feels like you'll know you hit it right when it feels this
It's
way.
the
You'll
same
know you did it right when
tennis.
it's, and yeah, and when it looks, you shoot the ball as soon as that, when that there's this, put that a particular pattern that you can, if you could, when it looks like this is happening, so you make an analogy, and some of the you need a that's the challenge in coaching. Like if you tried to teach someone, this is not I'm borrowing this from a colleague of mine in kinesiology, but he was talking about the skill of hula hooping, right? Imagine trying to teach someone like step by step, movement by movement, how to
I
hula
don't
hoop, right? Move your, oh boy. But if
know.
you just say something like, well, what you do is you throw it around yourself with your hip and you go, oh, well, of course that's how you do it. You have,
Right.
like, you just get, it's not about a moment by moment prescription, but about the outcome and about like, oh, well, it'll feel like a dance if you do it right, or if you'll feel like I don't know, that's sort of a thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
and
sorry, go on,
I,
Julia. Sorry.
I was just going to say that I think that to bring it back to what we were talking about at Attunement, that's that kind of coaching or that kind of teaching where you say, well, this is what it feels like when you get it right. It helps them become attuned to that information gradient by having them know when the outcome was right, right? When it was right, it was like this. Okay, well, I knew what that felt like. I know what went into that. I know how I moved in those circumstances, right? So it helps them become attuned to that gradient if you let them know where that gradient, where to look for it, where to put their attention.
There you go. So that's what I think the skill is for me is using constraints to direct attention.
Hmm.
So, or not direct it, but to
Hmm.
sort of make some aspects of the search space more attractive than others
Yeah,
in order to encourage more
absolutely.
exploration in that world. And that's the fundamental difference is that some people I think are thinking about using constraints to force movement upon people. Whereas it's not to do that. It's to just direct attention in certain places and then action emerges because all you've done is you've changed the problem parameters.
Hmm.
The other thing I really love about the ecological approaches, and I've written about this before, is what I think it really opens up and I love is so much agency. The athlete has agency because your job as a coach is not to sort of coerce them or to be some kind of puppeteer to sort of make them do certain things, which is what I used to try and do with structure and order and repetition. And I just want you to basically be like dancers, right? We're going to do choreography and you're just going to do this dance perfectly. And if we do it perfectly, we'll win. Until we didn't, and then it's like, whoa, well, we got to do more. The choreography wasn't good enough. Let's do it better. And then you're just so freed up when you don't think like that anymore. When you're not working from that assumption, and you're actually saying, let's see how we can coordinate together to solve a problem. Here's one. Here's another one. Here's another
Sure.
problem for you to solve. And actually watching groups, young people, older people, self-organize, but like work together
Hmm.
to find solutions to problems that you're presenting and seeing how immersed they can become in that experience, and that's a game. I call that a game. Here's a game, or is a problem to solve,
Okay.
and let's see how we can solve it together. Now, if I stop you, if I limit you in this way by saying that the space is now really narrow, how do we solve the problem then? But the beauty of that is it's the agency is with them. It's their problem solutions. And then I just listen to them and hear what they say, and then use that information to then put in new ideas and new constraints. It's joyous for me. It's a joyous experience. I nearly gave up because I was so miserable, like forcing people into doing these things.
Sure.
And finding the ecological approach has just been now just so freeing. And I genuinely believe it's more enjoyable for them. And this is where my ethical thing comes into it, because from my perspective, I felt deeply troubled about working the way I did traditionally. Felt like it was it didn't map onto my own value set, but equally it's so much difficulty and challenge and conflict. And all it was people saying, "I'd like to be a bit freer, please, coach. I'd like you not to force me into this box, please."
Sure.
And so coming away from that and actually being freed by saying, you know what? What we're going to do is we're going to work together to solve some problems. My job is to try and create some problems because I've got a bit of a knowledge about this game. And things will be very relevant. Certain things will be relevant. Less things, and let's explore together. And if you're really, really struggling, then I can start to maybe show you some things. But until that point, you guys have a good crack at this and see how we get on. It's a just better experience all round for everybody, or at least it is for me.
Because it turns out you're supposed to play in playing a sport.
This brings me back to the American developmental model in ice hockey. And one of the fundamental changes that they made several years ago was instead of making, so an ice hockey rink is hundreds of feet long. And if you have children playing on it, it takes them,
Oh.
especially if they're not great skaters, it takes them a matter of minutes to get all the way down.
Oh.
Like, and then it goes all the way back to the other end. So they said, no, no, no. We're going to have kids' games go across the ice.
Cross ice, yeah.
Now, yeah, now we don't have, now there's less, there's just less skating for no reason. The kids are going to touch the puck more often. We can get more kids on the ice because now we have three mini rinks instead of one big. I was just like, yes, that's what we need to be doing. Now you get like yeah, it's different than an actual ice hockey game, and yeah, but so what, right?
Yeah.
But what you're getting are you're providing constraints, but the constraints are about yielding outcomes rather than movements. It's really well done. That was one of the things that made me realize that they were onto something.
And hey, it
You
turns
you
out that variability is not noise. So it's okay if the game's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
they they uh they you wouldn't believe how much difficulty and criticism they received from adults about that decision. This is not the game and all that sort of stuff. So what one thing I would just want you to maybe go away from the conversation today with is to say that researchers like yourselves, and the fact that you've put together this book and the fact that you keep sort of nudging away at the frontiers of ecological psychology have influenced policymakers like the team at USA Hockey who created the ADM, and indirectly, whether it's directly or indirectly, influenced that thinking, which has then meant that ice hockey is now one of the most popular sports in the US, and young people have a really good experience and becoming more skillful and all of these sorts of things. So we all owe you a debt of gratitude for the work you're doing because it's helping, I think, those of us who are at the coalface and also those of us making policy to have the justification for these changes, which are better for children all round, really, and hopefully means that our continued efforts to make sport and physical activity relevant for young people who have a range of other possibilities in front of them. This stuff, I think, really helps us to make those kinds of arguments. So I, for one, would like to thank you for the work you've done.
Well, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Like we came into this from all of these, we're reporting on other people's work too. So, but thank you. Thank you.
And I will also, I thank you as well. And one of the things it's validating because, we do our science and we do it in our labs. And I, for one, often wonder,
What does it matter?
yeah, what does it matter? Is anybody reading this? And if they are, what are they taking from it? Is it actually doing anything?
Yeah.
And if I'll take your word for it that it is, and be heartened by that. So thank you.
Um, so yeah, so one thing I just wanted to say is I really like the fact that you use the word lawful. And I just very quickly wanted, before we wrap this up, like there's a particular reason you chose that word. And I'd love to know, just so that people know why you chose this word lawful, because I think it's a really important aspect as to sort of one of the whole rationales behind the book. So, Julia, would you explain that just so that we can go away with that idea in our minds?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an idea Jeff and I have talked about a lot, which is the idea that Psychology has always occupied a sort of strange space in science where we sort of, for whatever reason, assume that the science that's going to govern people and is going to be somehow different from the science that governs the movement of planets or balls rolling down a frictionless plane, and it just doesn't make any sense. Of course, our movements, of course, our perceptions, of course, everything else would be just as lawfully based as any of those other sciences would be. And it's just up to us to uncover what those lawful relationships are. And that if we make it arbitrary, it doesn't work, right? You're talking about the pragmatics of applying this all to sport and discovering that it works better, that's going to be true for everything, right? I think about it in human factors research. It's the same thing. You do things in one way, it doesn't work, but you do things in a way that acknowledges the lawfulness of our experience, and suddenly it does work. So, I mean, I think this is for us the reason why we chose the word lawful is to draw attention to the fact that these are just as lawfully based as any other science, and that when you treat it that way, it works better.
Yeah. I mean, that's so powerful for me because I think that's where a lot of when we have a lot of conversations and debates with practitioners who are more steeped in a more traditional approach, we talk past each other all the time, and it's so frustrating. And I think partly that's because they're coming from a different set of kind of laws in their own minds. And you often, I think in the book, you make reference to the fact that, the sort of traditional ideas behind Newtonian physics and geometry don't quite work. So you almost need the ecological version of those
Yes.
things.
I mean, yes, exactly. The laws are going to be ecological. They're not going to be the laws of physics, but they're still going to be laws,
Mm.
which means they're regular and dependable. Anyway, just send them our way. We'll take them. We'll give them a
And
little talking
the
to.
thing about laws is that they're independent of context,
Yes,
and so you change the context, the law doesn't change.
can change.
Other things might.
Yeah,
Right.
it's the first time I'd heard that articulation, and it was really important. And I know you say, by the way, you're standing on the shoulders of giants, but I thought it was a really important argument, and you set that up at the start, which is to say, I've had people say to me, like the ecological approach is completely nonsense. Why? Well, thermodynamics. I'm like, what? What? And now I realize why. What they're saying was actually, well, you got these things here, they just don't map up. Ah, yeah, but you're looking at it the wrong way.
Yeah, the wrong way. That's right. Is because if you try and treat people like we're a ball rolling down a frictionless plane, it's not going to work. There's still going to be laws, though. They're just going to be ones that are ecologically based.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm conscious I've taken up a lot of your time. We've been going for an hour and 45 minutes, which is a record. But sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
No, no, for me, it was a lot like your experience when you said you're in the flow with your athletes.
Right.
I feel this was great. I really enjoyed myself. This is a wonderful time. So thank you, bro. Thank you very much.
I feel like it's partly been a therapy session for me because of all the various challenges I've had, but I appreciate you uh, uh, staying patient with some of the stories and the kind of work, the things that I'm still struggling with a little bit
I
and
mean, you have
working
to
out in my
understand
own mind.
that for us, it's just as interesting to hear this stuff being made into real things in the real world. So that's just as interesting for us.
Mm. Well, I'm continuing with the study, but so first and foremost, you've been really generous with your time, and I really appreciate you coming on. By all accounts, the world of sport is reaching out and they want to speak to you. So it's really, really cool. I'm pretty certain, Jeff, that the hockey world, but obviously you're a very good double act, I've noticed. That you kind of like you riff off each other really well. Jeff even admitted in the video with Bren that he likes you going first, Julia, and then he then thinks it through and then comes through with the zingers afterwards. I've noticed that.
Yep. Yep.
We we
We
have
talked
developed
about
a really good partnership.
yes.
We found that we work well together. And yeah, so we're glad that other people noticed that.
Yes, very much. It's been a lot of years now, like almost a decade that we've been working together on projects. And so we've got sort of a shorthand and a rhythm that I think really works for us. He's my
And
work brother.
yes, there we go. I love that. You were tuned.
Yes.
So the You mentioned before we started recording that there's a second book in the works. Is there? Do I hear? Is this something that sports practitioners are going to be excited by?
I mean, we're writing a sensation and perception or textbook, right? So we're sensing and perceiving. We're gonna for undergraduate S&P classes. So maybe not as excited as they would be about our other book, but I certainly there will be things in there for all.
Will
And
Fred be in there?
no, I mean Fred's in I think a little bit, but we've been going with a baby elephant this time. Not exactly the same.
But the project after that is the second edition of our
Correct.
ecological book. So there will be a second edition of
Right.
that in a few years, by the time that gets all the way through.
Yeah, and actually that one might be of more interest too because we're planning on adding a social chapter. So that should probably include some of the things that you're interested in. Those interpersonal dynamics will be in that chapter as well. So there might be some stuff.
Well,
In the
I
works.
hope I might be able to entice you back if you're not too bruised by the first experience when that does come out, because I'd love to be able to kind of introduce it to this wider audience. I'm fairly
Totally.
certain there'll be a book club amongst my learning group in due course where we start to discuss the book in more detail. But listen, I really appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate you just doing what you're doing, and this is like the book that I've always kind of wanted and needed, and it's gonna there's gonna be a lot of Fred talk in this podcast over the next few episodes.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Stuart.
Thank you.